So we'll start by setting our motivation. So as we do, we generate the minds of confidence or faith in the Buddha's teachings, their relevance, their power in our own lives. In the mind of refuge, understanding that turning toward the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who deeply understand his teachings is how we find safe direction, how we orient ourselves out of suffering, out of confusion. And seeing that the point ultimately of doing that is not for oneself alone, but to become the Buddha jewel, to become that source of refuge. So we cultivate these minds of faith and refuge and bodhicitta. All right, and with that motivation, we will turn to the material. So last week, I believe we covered day 211, which was talking about the need to deeply understand suffering in order to understand what the appropriate antidotes to suffering are, even the subtlest sufferings and therefore the attendant subtlest antidotes, rather than our understanding of suffering remaining on a coarse level, a gross level, and therefore what would seem like appropriate antidotes being only coarse or gross antidotes. And in day 212, which is where we'll begin, Lama Zopa is going to talk about the meaning of samsara, the meaning of cyclic existence, and the phrasing that comes up with this is one's own samsara, or my samsara, as the way to reframe kind of this idea of samsara. The way that it's used is kind of like a noun is kind of makes it seem like something external, like, oh, because I took rebirth on the earth is samsara. And like it's something that is happening to oneself. It's something that is just, necessarily there is suffering in the world, and because I'm here in the world, I experience suffering. And that's not the right way to think about cyclic existence or samsara. Samsara is something that we are doing. It's kind of more of a verb. It's something that we are creating. And it is, the definition of samsara is to appropriate. So again, appropriation is a verb. To appropriate contaminated aggregates, or a body and mind that exists due to past karma and delusion. And so, because we have in this life so far been appropriating contaminated aggregates, we are experiencing samsara, we are experiencing ordinary cyclic existence. At the moment when we cease being under the influence of past karma and delusion and no longer appropriating aggregates, body and mind that exist due to karma and delusion, then our samsara, our cyclic existence, will cease. And that can cease either because we achieve individual liberation, or it can cease because we achieve full enlightenment, the two paths, the two valid paths taught by the Buddha, both leading to the cessation of cyclic existence. But in the Mahayana tradition, of course, as you know, in the Tibetan or Mahayana tradition, it's full enlightenment that we're encouraged to pursue in favor, favoring full enlightenment as opposed to individual liberation. But there are two valid paths, and they are both true cessations. They both end one's own samsara, one's own cyclic existence. But what Lama Zopa is pointing out here is that there is, I think we used this term also last week, or maybe the week before, that samsara has kind of a momentum. It has sort of its own inertia. It's sort of, with the phrasing that I use, or I don't know, that I found helpful just for my mind, is that it's sort of the path of least resistance, kind of like water, running downhill. It's just sort of, it's easier for the mind to create the causes of samsara than it is. In a way, it's sort of like, physics. You could sort of think of it like, well, if you look at like the arrow of time, if you look at the mathematics of the arrow of time from a deep physics perspective, there isn't actually a difference between time running forwards or time running backwards. But what they point out, what the physicists on a macroscopic level, though, is it's just extraordinarily unlikely that you'll observe time running backwards, that that an egg will uncook, or that something, a plate will unsmash. However, the physicists will tell you, in an infinitely long universe, at some point there, time will run backwards at some point, it's in some local point in time, because the laws of physics don't actually distinguish between forward and backward. So I don't know if that's helpful or just a tangent, but in a way, it's again this idea of the path of least resistance, that that the universe permits enlightenment, but they don't make it particularly easy. It isn't the path of least resistance. It has the causes of enlightenment have to be intentionally cultivated, and it's not easy to create all of those causes and conditions, as evidenced by the fact that we've been participating in cyclic existence since whatever beginningless time means, and we still haven't done it. Other sentient beings, they've done it. Many Buddhas exist, but there are still yet an extraordinarily large number, perhaps a nearly infinitely large number of ordinary sentient beings who've been remaining in or participating in cyclic existence since beginningless time, because amassing those causes and those conditions are not the path of least resistance. And so our mind is perfectly happy to continue dying and appropriating contaminated aggregates again and again and again, unless and until we intentionally put an end to that process. It does have its own continuity, it does have its own momentum, and it's not going to peter out by itself. They talk about, there's an idea that that the force of, given that you have a pool of unenlightened ordinary sentient beings, and the only thing that they can do is either stay there or go into the other pool of enlightened beings, because also beings experiencing lower nirvana have the option of also continuing, kind of being aroused, awakened by enlightened beings and continuing to train, and therefore also progressing into full enlightenment. That is an option. So ultimately, because you can't move back from the state of enlightenment back into the state of being ordinary, but you can move from the state of being ordinary into the state of being enlightened, that energy will grow over time. We can say it has been, growing, and it can only continue to grow, just based on the sort of math of it. So, they say that given that, it will become stronger and stronger, and the influence, perhaps, of enlightened beings within cyclic existence will become stronger and stronger. So at some point, they make the argument that given that we will achieve enlightenment, and it's kind of just a matter of time, but it's a matter of, is it a little bit of time or an extraordinarily, unfathomable amount of time between now and then. That's one argument that is made about that process. But still, we will never be off the hook from creating those causes and those conditions through our own efforts. It's not like magically at some point, it's just there will be so much enlightened activity that it will become, I can't say, I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but it seems like it'll just become so obvious that that's the thing to do, and it'll become easier with all of the enlightened activity that's able to permeate ordinary cyclic existence, that everybody will kind of start getting with the program. as opposed to whereas now it's so much more difficult. Um, and but that seems to be an argument that's made that kind of is true. Uh, there's probably other people that make other arguments, and but still, even at that time, it isn't that something magical will happen to our mind. Still, we have to engage in all of the stages of the path to create those inner causes and conditions. It'll just become, I would think, more obvious to do that. Yeah, you have a question.
Are you saying, or is someone saying that that it's it's difficult because these are the degenerate times, basically?
Well, so the cycles of there's cosmic cycles that they talk about, and right now it is true that we are in a cycle of decline, and but that's in reference to Buddha Shakyamuni's kind of epoch, or and so but of course it was degenerate times even when that was why he appeared in the world. But this kind of time kind of belongs to that wheel turning. There will be, and so this will continue. The view is that this is going to get worse in terms of this process of degeneration, but then it doesn't, it increases then again, and then it decreases. So over unbelievably long periods of time, these cycles go up and down. um, and and so, yeah, and I don't know if at some point they talk about that it doesn't go back, that like the going down stops, or if kind of on one of the up, because the upswings, because we're talking about incredibly long periods of time, like cosmic, universe creating and abiding, trillions of years, and this sort of thing. Um, it could be that within one of the increasing periods, at some point, kind of like is when all of the final, maybe in ordinary beings will achieve that enlightenment during some period of billions of years that's on the upswing. And then the fact that there could be a down, would otherwise be a downswing, maybe isn't relevant because there won't be anyone left once they get to the top. That I don't, that's kind of hard to map exactly. I don't know for sure, but the fact that that there is this age of degeneration is just characterizing a specific point in time, and it isn't eternal. It does have these very long increases and decreases. So he says, until we are liberated from the suffering of samsara, everything we do is in the nature of suffering, as long as our aggregates are contaminated by ignorance. Whenever one of our senses meets an object, delusion arises, motivating a karmic action that leaves a negative imprint that sooner or later results in suffering. This is a story, he says, that repeats itself 1,000,000 times a day. So, I mean, which is a little bit intense, but the good news is that even with a deluded mind, we have the seed of wisdom. And so it is possible, so it isn't like we need an undiluted mind in order to have an undiluted mind. That's kind of is what it might seem like, which isn't the case. The present mind although it is afflicted, although it is deluded, is sufficient to grow the seed of wisdom that's also present in the mind strong enough that this, as he's saying, this fundamental ignorance is overcome. And then our interaction with objects isn't the cause of suffering, and then it's not. So that's the good part of all of that, is that this body and mind is still sufficient to fan the flames of our wisdom to the point where we do completely overcome this fundamental ignorance. We don't have to somehow have a magical state change where fundamental ignorance has to be gone in order for it to be gone. That's luckily not what's true. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about day 212? Okay, so day 213, Lama Zopa is going to talk about so in this chapter or this section broadly, there's a few different sort of broad topics that are touched on. And here this is continuing the topic of the specific sufferings of cyclic existence, and indefiniteness is one of those sufferings. It's usually called indefiniteness. It is just one of the we'll be looking at others. We can look forward to a variety of these specific sufferings. He says, nothing is definite in samsara. There is nothing that we can say with certainty will last. So this occurs in different ways within lifetimes and across lifetimes. Any time within a lifetime, any time that we come together with something pleasant, something beneficial, enjoyable, etc., will be separated from that coming together. Whether it is, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't ever contact it again, but it means that coming together does fall apart. So we might eat really good food, but then that experience is time limited. We might be successful in repeating that experience again in the future, but again, it's time limited. It's only going to persist for a certain period. And then we have to deal with maybe craving and grasping at the fact that, I do want it to happen again. I almost need for it to happen again, in order to feel satisfied next week or tomorrow, what have you. And then, of course, this is true of the association between our body and mind that separates at death. It's true of any relationship, any meeting that we have between people. They either, they end just in estrangement, or they end in someone's death, ours or theirs. So there's no coming together of any two things. And of course, on the flip side, also true that painful things don't last forever. Rebirth in the hell realms, may last for a very long time, but it doesn't last forever. It comes to an end, and then, of course, but that again also doesn't mean that can't and won't be experienced again in the future. Just means that it came together and then it will cease. So this idea of indefiniteness is just a feature of cyclic existence. It characterizes the coming together of any two things. It's painful only in relation to the coming together of ourselves with something that we find pleasant. This quality or characteristic of cyclic existence is painful in that aspect, but it's also a valid characteristic of cyclic existence in all aspects, because any two things that come together will separate. And then, so of course, like I said, higher realm rebirths will also end, and then they could very well end in lower realm rebirths, and then those lower realm rebirths will end, and they could very well end in upper realm rebirths. But there's no stability, there's nothing reliable, there's nothing definite, there's nothing lasting. Whenever anything comes together, because it's ordinary and it's part of part of our samsara, it will fall apart. So then there's a famous story from the sutras that's a bit disturbing, where he talks about Shariputra, which was one of the disciples of the Buddha. He's in the Heart Sutra. It's kind of known for that, but he was known to be clairvoyant. He had achieved arhatship, and so it says here, when he looked through the door of a house, he saw that the former father of that household, meaning, so there was a mother and a father and a child, the father had passed away, was now a fish that had been caught by the sun and was being eaten by the family, and that the former mother was now a dog at the son's feet. So I guess maybe both the father and the mother had died, and the son was kind of fending for himself. The former mother was now a dog at the son's feet, chewing on the bones of her former husband. And that the former son was cradling his former hated enemy who had been reborn as his child, and beating the dog, his mother, with a stick. Eating the father's flesh, beating the mother, cuddling the enemy. How samsara makes me laugh. Shariputra is when he beheld this. So, we talk about these karmic, relationships that we have, so Buddhism would say that everyone that you meet, because there's, whatever, 8 billion people on the earth right now, and we're not going to meet, but maybe a couple, maybe a few thousand of them, if we think about, malls and crowds, and so over the course of 70 years, we've been in the same room with thousands, or maybe even tens of thousands and we go to concerts, of course, could be maybe hundreds of thousands for some people, but certainly not more than that, not millions, and yet there's 8 billion humans alive. And so Buddhism would say that anyone that we come across, we have some karmic connection with that's, reasonably recent. We have some karmic connection with every, Buddhism would say, of course, that since every sentient being has been our mother, in a past life, we are karmically connected to all sentient beings. But the strength of that karmic connection at any given point in time is going to be determined by the immediately preceding lifetimes. And so we're more closely, at this moment in time, we're more closely connected to a smaller group of beings. It is a more powerful connection. So certainly the people in our immediate family, we have a karmic, but as Shariputra is pointing out here, we can't say that it, was like, oh, my mother has always been my mother, or, it's, it can manifest in these really weird ways that are not intuitive. Um, so if we have a family pet or something, that could have been a family member that, that we were closely connected to. And that's, samsara is weird, as he says, it's that the bonds don't manifest in ways that we might hope for or might seem logical between lifetimes. Any thoughts or questions about day 212, day 213? So then in day 214, Lama Zopa is going to come back to a theme, that's really prevalent as a kind of a through line in all of his books and teachings, the mind of dissatisfaction, the mind of discontent, as being one of the principal motivating states of mind that drive our own cyclic existence, that help to activate, and you could call this craving and grasping, from the Buddhist perspective, if you want to use kind of the traditional language of like the 12 links, where due to craving and grasping, oftentimes it's either, it would be contaminated karma that would be ripened, whether it's contaminated positive karma or contaminated negative karma. But due to craving and grasping, it being kind of a baseline state in the mind, we would expect contaminated karma to be activated, which is going to drive the process of ordinary rebirth. So he calls this the main problem. The main problem we all have, he says, is the suffering that comes from not attaining our various desires, from being, wishing, having this craving and grasping, and then being thwarted. He says, in one way or another, we all hunger uncontrollably for things that we do not possess. So this mind of constant dissatisfaction, this mind of, Venerable Urbina calls this like the vampire, the kind of this mind of never being satisfied, never having enough, this deep kind of like an emptiness, not emptiness in the Buddhist sense, but like a hole that we can't ever fill, like a neediness, that we are constantly thinking, oh, if I just keep eating this, or if I keep, watching, then this will go away, then this will not be part of my experience, and yet doesn't work. We try those things, and this neediness only increases. Venerable Yunten, at one time used the analogy of that's like drinking salt water, to quench our thirst. So he gives the example, and this also came up before in the previous classes in this section, where even if you look at someone who's incredibly wealthy, who's has access to the best, food and safest environment, best schools, best education, more money than they could spend, He says, when they finally reach the point at which there's nothing left to possess, no place left to visit, no pleasure left to experience, they will still suffer from an acute feeling of dissatisfaction. In such a restless, dissatisfied state of mind, he says, many people go insane, unable to cope with the intense and pervasive suffering. So, when this came up before, we were talking about, it seems true. It seems true that when people achieve fame, too quickly, at a young age, they can't cope, with it. They've been able to eat all of the things that they wanted to eat, and so they turn to drugs. They turn to, not certainly not true for all people, but it seems like that there's a correlation between suicide, drug addiction, and being able to demonstrate to yourself that money and power and fame are not really all that great. For us, we haven't done that. We don't have billions of dollars. We're not famous, and so we think, oh well, maybe if I get that. But it seems like the people who do get that, they're also even maybe more unhappy because they've proven to themselves that it doesn't work, and there's nothing left to try. There's nothing, again, kind of this idea of like the vampire, like, vampires who live for billions of, not, but, thousands and thousands of years, they've been able to have all of these pleasures out in the world, and they've been able to amass. And, kind of seems like, as a thought experiment, if you look at the literature, a lot of those characters are really depressed. They're really, and I think it's this, so it's the same sort of thing. They kind of, all that's left for them to do is die. And that's what they want. So, I mean, even in our imagination, even kind of in our zeitgeist, we can recognize that we don't want that. We don't want to live for thousands and thousands of years and being able, but all that really is a continuity of memory in which we remember having demonstrated to ourselves that all of these things that are open to us are ineffective. But what is true is that we have done that simply without that continuity of memory. We've had all of the pleasures of cyclic existence over the course of beginningless past lives. And thankfully, we haven't gone insane because there isn't that continuity of personal memory and personal identity. But it's nonetheless true that we have demonstrated that to ourselves over the course of beginningless past lives, just not all at once with the same continuity of personal identity and memory.
Venerable, it sometimes strikes me that, when we say as an older person, gosh, if I knew now what I knew then, I would have made maybe different choices or whatever. So hearing that, it strikes me in that tone a little bit. One of the things that said at the very beginning of this section is that it includes, obviously the physical ones, but the more subtle ones, like a good reputation, something that Chris and I were talking about, that it almost gets more and more subtle as time goes on. You catch yourself thinking, well, if you catch yourself enough times, you're lucky. But it's a weird one somehow to me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Venerable Urbina would kind of say the same thing in the sense that she points out that the hardest thing to overcome, like, it's not that it's difficult to overcome like our addiction to good food or good music, or intimate relationships, what have you. But wanting to be thought well of is like one of the most pernicious and subtle, as you're saying. So these do exist, on a spectrum, certainly, and we can work on. There's some that are easier to work on than others. We can learn to eat simpler food, and be satisfied and not miss it, not miss the more complicated or, over time, but they say the yogis in the cave might be really concerned about what the townspeople are saying about them and, wanting them to, be thinking, oh, what a great practitioner that yogi in the cave is. They're so renounced and, you know, yeah, so wanting to be thought of in the ways that we enjoy is certainly much more difficult. Okay, so day 215 is again this other specific suffering that the suffering of death. Um, he says we jump from one body to another, just as a monkey jumps from branch to branch. So, having appropriated ordinary samsaric aggregates, we have no choice. We don't have control over the process of rebirth. We will separate again and again. Um, he says we've taken a human body and the body of every kind of animal, god, demigod, hungry ghost, and hell being, and have had to leave them countless times. So, yeah, just the suffering of death, the suffering of rebirth, um, is sort of, in a way, an example of indefiniteness, but it's a specific suffering of death. He says like all samsaric pleasures, even the incredibly long and luxurious life of a desire realm god, because nothing is definite. When that happens, the beautiful palaces made of jewels will be replaced by a burning iron house without doors or windows. The divine nectar that is their food will become molten lava poured down their throat. The wonderfully soft ground of lapis lazuli will become a field of razor-sharp knives, and the beautiful boy and girl gods who played with them will become fearsome, karmically created hell protectors with hideous animal heads, whose one job is to torment. The palace is radiating great light, like the sun and moon become a realm of utter blackness, where the former god can't see even their own body. So these gods have attained the peak, the highest state within. And so when they fall, it's quite likely that they would fall, and they've exhausted incredible stores of merit by sustaining that life. So there's not much at that moment, there's not much left to make it likely that, say, a human realm rebirth would manifest. So quite likely then that they fall all the way back down to the hell realms, which is being described. Um, so we should disabuse ourselves of any notion of thinking of achieving that kind of life as being something valuable, being something of any benefit. Um, Different. This isn't talking about the Pure Lands. This is talking about just a god or demigod in probably maybe here the formless realm, or either the form or formless realm, but totally ordinary cyclic existence kind of rebirth. He says we have this body for the briefest moment and then it is gone. Because of that, there's no reason to have any attachment at all, even to our closest possession, our body. Or again, like I said, to think that there are any bodies, even the body of a God, that we ought to be attached to, that we ought to see as something to want to create the causes and the conditions to. Of course, the exception being a realistic understanding that if it happens that we don't create the causes and conditions for enlightenment within this lifetime, then we need another lifetime in order to create those causes and those conditions, and that could be either in a pure land where the teachings on that, where that can be accomplished, or a perfect human rebirth, where that also can be accomplished. But the mind, seems like the mind is really just absorbed in bodhicitta. It isn't really, and it's like, well, whatever kind of rebirth is best for accomplishing bodhicitta is the kind of, it isn't to say, oh, I'd like to be 6 feet tall and I'd like to, have this kind of, form. It's just bodhicitta. It's just due to bodhicitta motivation, whatever arises that will allow me to accomplish my aim of benefiting sentient beings is what I want to arise. Okay. Any thoughts or questions?
I just, that reminded me of something that the Dalai Lama once said, and I don't know if I heard it from you or from somebody else, but he said to some teenagers that not to be afraid of death, because it's just like changing your clothes. Death is just, instead of jumping from branch to branch, it's just like taking off your clothes and putting on new ones. That it's that simple. I just thought that was just, that one, I understood that. The jumping from branch to branch, yeah, no, I got the change in your clothes. So anyways.
Any other thoughts or questions? Otherwise, it's a good place to end for today. So we'll end with dedication. So bring to mind our positive motivation. Think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind. That positive energy will ripen in beneficial, supportive ways. And we think about the specific spiritual causes and conditions that we want to activate, establish. Specifically dedicate that positive energy as those causes, those conditions. So bring to mind how you would like to dedicate. All right. So have a good weekend. We will pick it back up on Monday.